Before I talk about the revolutionary Christian aspect of healing that is manifest in the 12 steps, wanted to tell you a story about my son when he was little, and he gave me permission as long as he's not here, and he's not here. So when he was very little, about 2.5, he just refused to keep his pants on. Now, any parents out there who know about trying to toilet train your children, this is a good thing in some ways, except that he would run down our street naked. And so finally, I said, listen, Damien, you just can't run around naked. And he said, all wide-eyed and innocent, well, can I walk? We want what we want. It's the moral of that story. And then I also thought, in preparing for today, about some of the early jobs I had as a young person. You know, when you're first out of university and you're kind of just getting your feet wet and you're trying to get some opportunity. And then, like now, a lot of those opportunities are volunteer. So I volunteered for a marvelous place that still exists called the Margaret Fraser House. And the Margaret Fraser House provided counsel and housing to women who were being released from psychiatric institutions, women with mental health issues. And I was just volunteering, but I really wanted a full-time job. And I recognized very early on that the only way I would get a full-time job there was if one of the full-timers actually left. There was this amazing woman who worked at Margaret Fraser House, and when she wasn't working there, she would do what is called death sits. She would go to hospitals where someone was dying and had no one to stay with them, and she would stay with them until they died. Incredible ministry. And one night we were doing an overnight shift at Margaret Fraser House, and she started saying to me, and with no surprise, I suppose, that she was kind of getting tired of dealing with mental illness and with death all the time. And she really wanted to shift her life and to get involved in the other end of life, birth, and become a midwife. Now, this was before Google, so my little Machiavellian brain kind of lit up, and I thought, okay, we could do this. So I went to the library, did the research, found out, it was quasi-legal in those days, that you had to go down to Mexico, and that's where you could be trained and you could get certified, and then you'd have to have so many births that you witnessed, etc. I found all of this stuff out for her. I got her phone numbers, contacts. Next time we were on the overnight shift together, I gave it all to her, and hoping she would pick up on this and leave. She did not. And I moved on to other things. I went into business and forgot all about this, actually. Forgot all about this until some 10 years later, I got a phone call from her. And she said, I am opening a midwifery clinic on the Danforth, and it would never have happened without your help. Whoa. Talk about feeling guilty. But really, isn't that how God, the source of all love, works through our lives? This is the way God works through our lives. And when you look over the entire story of the Bible, you see God working through, nefarious people just like me. Moses, murderer. David, adulterer. Moving right along, Joseph, scammer. And then into the New Testament, what do you got? You got Peter, denier, Thomas, doubter, and Paul, Brother Paul, the great evangelist, a murderer of Christians. This is how God works, through people just like us. The origins of the 12-step group was a group called the Oxford Group, and it was profoundly Christian. It was evangelical Christian Methodist. It started in the early part of the 19th century, and the idea was to do something that could not be done in church, to get Christians together in small groups, and to get them to talk to each other, to confess those dark secrets of theirs to each other, to find healing with each other, no clergy in the room, help each other, and then move from helping each other out into the world to help others. These were their principles: sharing our weakness, surrendering to God, effecting restitution, developing further that relationship with God, and then, in a sense, going out and paying it forward. The two great sins that the Oxford group recognized were really the two great sins, if we think about sin as separation from the divine: selfishness and fear. Two great sins. And they found that meeting in these small groups actually helped. Now, the movement started in the early part of the 19th century, and it literally spread like wildfire all through Europe. It was, of course, not just the precursor to the 12-step groups, also precursor to group therapy. It was a therapeutic community. And who discovered it but the founders of Alcoholics Anonymous, who had tried everything else to cure their addiction and had ventured into one of these groups. And unlike the medical treatments that they were receiving, this worked. And then they took it off, and of course, it's a household name now. We have 12 12-step groups meeting just in this church. Millions of people, as we speak, are meeting in 12-step groups for all sorts of issues. It is arguably, even if its efficacy isn't right up there, one of the greatest healing systems ever invented. No pharmaceuticals involved, just giving it up to God and meeting and loving each other. Now, if we think, well, I'm not an alcoholic, I'm not a drug addict, this has nothing to do with me, think again. There was a lovely little book written decades ago called Addiction and Grace by a doctor, Gerald May. And he said, addiction is simply that which we fill our God-shaped hole with, you know? It's the stuff that focuses our life. It's the stuff that we spend most of our time on. So it could be relationships, it could be being good, was one of the examples he gave, approval, status, work, money. Whatever we're focused on that isn't the source of love, that isn't love in our life, that then becomes a kind of addiction for us. Now, when we talk about spirituality in the United Church, I, as well as others, get a little queasy about it, because what is spirituality? You know, it's every week that you find some guru or other who's, exposed for being just in it for the money, or, a sexual profligate or whatever. And it made me think of Bertrand Russell quote, and he said, "If you search for wisdom diligently enough, someone will try to sell it to you." It's not about that, though, is it, in terms of growing spiritually? It's not about that at all. It's not about working your way to God either. The Reformation took care of that. Certainly Martin Luther and Calvin and all of those who fought against the selling of indulgences and the idea that somehow little old us can work our way to the divine. Somehow we would, by what we do, be worthy of that incredible love. They said it's just plain misguided theology. None of us are truly worthy of that great love, any more than I was worthy to cut the ribbon on that midwifery clinic. But that great love exists. We are beloved, and the answer to the selfishness and fear, the two great sins, is to recognize that we are loved. So when you listen to the first of the steps of the 12-step program, you hear that it's all about that, really. The first step, we admitted we were powerless over our lives and that they'd become unmanageable. You don't have to be an addict of the obvious sort to sometimes, at some point, recognize that. Last week, we talked about trauma, and we talked about how when something traumatic, usually death, happens in your life, that this is the time when most people discover mysticism. that they discover an encounter, some encounter they can't quite explain away with the divine. It's in those times. And it's also in those times that you recognize the value of Christian community, that there's a whole church there walking with you, being with you, supporting you through those tough times. That's when you discover it. When trauma happens in your life. But there's another time you discover it too. And that's when you're the source of your own trauma. That's when you get that you're not quite the person you really should be. That somehow you've let people down. Maybe you let yourself down. You certainly let God down. And that's a time when you kind of recognize what you've been doing isn't working and you got to try something new. So the second one, came to believe that a power greater than ourselves could restore us to sanity. Third one, made a decision to turn our will and our lives over to the care of God as we understood God. 4, make a searching and fearless moral inventory of ourselves. What are we doing with our lives? 6, admitted to God, to ourselves, and to another human being the exact nature of our wrongs. This is like the old confessional, but not really, because you're not looking to another human for absolution. You're just sharing the reality of your life. You're being honest, maybe for the first time. 7, we're entirely ready to have God remove those defects, and humbly asked for that is step 8. So it's not about working our way to God. The warning signs always are this: when we think it's all up to us, it never, ever, ever is. When we think we're right, big red flag on that one. The biggest one, when we think we're alone, we're not. That's when we cease to trust in that source of all love. One more story from a summer job, this time at work for the Workmen's Compensation Board, now WSIB. And I was a clerk, and I was just doing mundane stuff, filing cases. And I came across this one case that I talked to one of the caseworkers about that I thought was kind of fascinating. It was this man who complained, like many do, walking into WSIB even today, about back pain, about back injury, and said he was a bricklayer, that he couldn't work anymore because of the pain in his back. And he'd been through some half-dozen doctors, both inside and outside the board, and all of them said, you know, we don't see anything, and what might be there can be solved by just taking a pill. And he kept complaining, and then finally he saw it was going to work. So then he came back and reapplied, saying that he couldn't work because he clearly was crazy, because he imagined that he had pain in his back, and so that we should give him disability because he imagined that there was pain in his back. Our will. We want what we want when we want it, no matter how crazy it is. Here's the good news. My son grew up to put his pants on. The workman's comp guy finally gave up and got a job. The midwifery clinic opened. I didn't have to do anything. I didn't have to make any of it happen. It happened. And finally, when I started into ministry, I had another summer job, and this was again volunteer in part through the ministry program. And I went to a seniors residence where a lot of the seniors suffered from dementia or Alzheimer's, and part of my job was to feed them. People couldn't feed themselves. And I remember this one lovely lady, and I was feeding her, and she looked at me. I'd never seen her before in my life, and she said, "I love you. I've always loved you. You should know that." Clearly thinking I was someone else. But you know what? She was right. So be loved, beloved. Know that there is nothing that you're facing alone. Know that there is nothing that you're struggling with alone. Know this community stands with you and loves you. Know that God is always with you and always loves you. And know that it's not all up to you, and that there is nothing to fear. Amen.
further than I can see. I see the love of God in every valley, offering shelter to you and me. I see the love of God in every mountain, standing fast through eternity. The love of God is all around me, whatever the trouble, pain, or care. The love of God is all around me. If I will look, I'll find it there. I see the love of God in eyes of hope.